Why did no one look at her twice when she entered the room? Why did they keep laughing, even as her stillness began to change the temperature of the air? The officers' club pulsed with noise. Silver bars and gold braid glinted under soft amber lights. The smell of champagne mixed with the heavy scent of leather chairs and polished wood. Freshly minted lieutenants clustered in knots of self-congratulation. Their laughter carried the brittle tone of people desperate to prove they belonged. It was a ritual night, a promotion party, where the newest officers learned how to perform power before they truly held it. At the far wall, the woman stood alone. Her uniform bore no insignia, no ribbons, no name tape. A simple, unadorned duty blouse, sleeves rolled precisely once, hair tied in a functional knot. She could have been an aide sent to clean up the paperwork afterward. She could have been no one at all. That was the point. She wanted to see what they would reveal when they believed they were unobserved. Captain Decker, newly promoted and basking in the glow of his moment, spotted her like a stage actor finds a prop. "Someone get her a clipboard," he said to no one in particular, raising his champagne flute for emphasis. "Administrative staff aren't supposed to mingle with command." The cadets laughed, not because the joke was funny, but because laughter was a reflex, a way of aligning themselves with the rising star in front of them. Decker thrived on it, feeling his authority swell with every chuckle. His voice carried a sharp edge of condescension. "Seriously, is this what we've come to? Letting paper pushers drink with war fighters? No wonder our readiness scores are slipping." She didn't react. Her gaze swept the room in slow, methodical arcs, cataloging everything. Faces, body language, who looked to whom before laughing, who avoided eye contact, who flinched at Decker's tone. Her hands hung loose at her sides, relaxed but not limp. Her weight distribution, the slight angle of her feet, the calm cadence of her breathing, all of it betrayed a discipline no clipboard carrier would possess. Colonel Matt, the base commander, stood near the bar, watching. He had received the coded message a week ago, a technical observer from Strategic Command, clearance level beyond top secret. Provide unrestricted access. Do not interfere. He had assumed an older man in a suit. Instead, here was this specter of a woman, anonymous yet commanding the air by her mere presence. And Decker was making the worst possible mistake, assuming what he saw was all there was. The colonel's stomach tightened as Decker took a step closer to her, preparing to escalate his performance. A silent prayer flickered in Matt's mind. "Let me stop this before it goes too far." He could see in her stillness the coiled potential of someone who had been underestimated all her life and had learned to weaponize it. She shifted her weight minutely, a breath drawn slow and deliberate, eyes still scanning. To everyone else, she remained a piece of furniture. To the colonel, she was a live wire. The cadets' laughter grew louder, feeding Decker's ego. They saw only what he told them to see, a plain woman who didn't belong. They missed the scar faintly tracing her left temple, almost hidden by her hairline. They missed the black, non-reflective chronometer on her wrist, not standard issue anywhere. They missed the absence of any telltale fear in her posture. Her silence was not weakness. It was a mirror. In it, Decker was showing his entire command his own inadequacies, vanity masquerading as leadership, noise replacing competence. She stood in the middle of the officers' club like an accusation made flesh. The colonel took a step forward, ready to intervene, and then the room itself intervened. A piercing high-frequency alarm sliced through the laughter. The base AI's cold, synthetic voice followed, flat and chilling. "Code Omega. Code Omega. All command personnel to Simulation Center Level 4. This is not a drill." Every glass froze midair. Smiles vanished. Red emergency lights bled across the polished wood, turning the celebration into a nightmare tableau. Code Omega. The phrase carried the weight of legend. A doomsday scenario so complex it had been run only twice in the base's history, and never as a surprise. A cascading systems failure combined with a near-peer enemy offensive, designed to break even seasoned command teams. Captain Decker's swagger evaporated. The new silver bars on his collar felt suddenly heavy. This was his first real test since the promotion. His hands twitched toward a command tablet that wasn't there. His mouth opened, but no orders came out. Around him, officers scrambled for the exits in a frantic, disorganized rush. The woman did not move at first. She let the surge pass her, then flowed through it like water around rocks, her stride long and purposeful. No running, no panic. She reached the door before anyone else. Colonel Matt watched her go, dread and recognition knotting together in his chest. This was no coincidence. Only one person on the base had the authority to trigger a code Omega without his knowledge. Decker barked a string of contradictory orders. Someone get me a sitrep. Where's my command tablet? Form up, form up. His voice cracked under the weight of his own panic. Down the corridor, the woman's calm was an indictment. Her every step radiated a quality of energy that set her apart from the chaos behind her. She was not being tested. She was conducting the test. The simulation center was a cavern of controlled chaos, dominated by a massive holographic map glowing with angry red icons. Enemy units, system failures, cascading alerts. Technicians and officers shouted over each other. Sector Gamma is gone. EMP blast knocked out comms. I'm losing the drone swarm. The AI droned on, announcing each new catastrophe with machine neutrality. Aegis defense grid at 30%. Cascade failure imminent. Captain Decker stood at the main command console, eyes darting, paralyzed. Data streamed too fast to process. His academy scenarios had never looked like this. He issued a weak command to reinforce a flank already vaporized. The senior NCO beside him physically winced. The woman entered the room without a sound. She didn't announce herself. She didn't even look at Decker. Her eyes swept the holographic display, not with alarm but with detached analysis, like a master chess player examining a board. She crossed the floor to a small secondary diagnostics terminal in the corner, a station most officers considered obsolete. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, pure kinetic competence. She wasn't typing words. She was writing code, inputting direct command line overrides into the simulation's core programming. The grizzled master sergeant in charge of the center watched, jaw slack. He saw her bypass 3 security layers with a string of code he didn't recognize. She wasn't fighting the simulation. She was rewriting its rules. On the main screen, red enemy icons blinked, flickered, and one by one went dark. A single message appeared stark white on black. Checkmate. Unknown protocol executed. Simulation terminated. Silence fell. Technicians froze mid-motion. Even the AI stopped speaking. Colonel Matt entered, footsteps echoing. He walked past stunned officers and an ashen Decker, eyes fixed on the woman by the secondary console. He stopped a few feet from her, his expression a mixture of respect and astonishment. In 30 years he had seen masters of strategy. He had never seen anything like this. He cleared his throat, the sound making several people jump. "Ma'am," he said quietly, voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "Request permission to ask what protocol that was." The use of ma'am was a thunderclap. Decker's head snapped up. "Sir, she's just a clerk, she." Matt silenced him with a glare so cold it could have frozen fire. He turned back to the woman. She met his gaze for the first time, eyes calm, intelligent, bottomless. "It's a fail-safe," she said softly but clearly. "A logic bomb built into the simulation's core. Code Omega isn't about winning. It's an unwinnable scenario. Its only purpose is to measure command response under catastrophic failure." The implications settled over the room like a physical weight. Decker hadn't just failed a test. He had failed the only part that mattered. Matt nodded slowly, the pieces clicking into place. The audit, the observer, the impossible drill, all connected. He walked to the main command terminal. "Computer," he ordered, voice ringing. "Access service record. Voice authorization Matt Delta 19er. Search active duty personnel. Designation Spectre." The system word. Decker let out a short, nervous laugh. Spectre, sir, that's just a myth, a ghost story they tell cadets. The laugh died as a file bloomed onto the main holographic display. Silence deepened. Vast sections were blacked out by redactions labeled Classification YXCO, but what was visible stole the breath from every person present. The name read VANCE. Unit, Joint Special Operations Command, Strategic Assessment Group 7, so secret most of them had never heard of it. Mission history classified. Combat hours classified. A cascade of the highest honors filled the screen: Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with 3 oak leaf clusters, Defense Superior Service Medal. And at the top, rank General 010. A 4-star general. The woman in the plain uniform, ridiculed as a clipboard-carrying clerk, held the highest active duty rank in the armed forces. Colonel Matt turned from the screen, face solemn. He drew himself to full height and executed the sharpest salute of his career, not the perfunctory gesture of a subordinate but one of genuine, soul-deep reverence. "General Vance," he said, voice thick with emotion, "my apologies for the unprofessional reception you've received on my base." General Vance nodded once, accepting both salute and apology with quiet grace. Captain Decker looked as if he had been struck. His career, his understanding of the chain of command, his entire persona had just been demolished. The architect of the impossible test stood before him, and he had failed in every conceivable way. Around them, the silence of the simulation center was no longer simple shock. It was the beginning of a reckoning. How do you look a legend in the eyes when you've just mocked her? How do you stand in a room that has become a mirror reflecting everything you are not? Captain Decker couldn't move. His hands hovered uselessly over the console. The red glow of the emergency lights painted his face the color of a wound. Around him, the junior officers stood frozen, their breaths shallow, their bodies turned ever so slightly toward the woman at the secondary terminal, the only point of stillness in the chaos. General Vance did not speak. She simply wiped the screen of the terminal with the sleeve of her uniform, a small, methodical gesture. The faint sound of fabric on glass carried across the cavernous room, louder than Decker's heartbeat in his own ears. Colonel Matt held his salute for a long moment, then lowered his arm with a crisp snap. "General," he said quietly, "the exercise is complete." She inclined her head once, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. "Assessment concluded," she replied. Her voice was soft, not cold, but in it was a finality that made the air seem heavier. The AI's voice returned, neutral and inexorable. "Simulation terminated. All personnel stand by for debrief." Officers began to stir like swimmers surfacing from deep water. A few exchanged glances of dawning comprehension. Others stared at the floor. One by one, they straightened their uniforms, faces pale. The room was no longer a simulation center. It had become a tribunal. Decker's throat worked as he tried to speak. "General Vance, I..." Her gaze flicked to him, calm and unreadable. She did not interrupt. She did not forgive. She simply looked at him, and in that look was an unspoken question. "What will you do now, Captain?" But Decker had no answer. Later, in the briefing room adjacent to the simulation center, the officers filed in silently. The room was stark, brushed steel table, rows of chairs bolted to the floor, a single plaque bearing the base's motto, "Strength without noise." The irony hung over them like a storm cloud. General Vance stood at the head of the table, hands behind her back, posture relaxed but precise. Colonel Matt stood to her right, his expression neutral. The officers filled the seats without being told, like schoolchildren after a fire drill gone wrong. She let the silence stretch. It wasn't a power play. It was an absence into which each person's thoughts poured, amplifying their own discomfort. Finally, she spoke. "Code Omega is not about tactics," she said. "It's about clarity under collapse. It is about seeing, about listening, about humility." Her words fell into the room like stones into still water. Every catastrophic failure begins with an assumption. You assumed your systems would hold. You assumed your enemy would behave predictably. You assumed your peers were who they appeared to be. She paused, eyes sweeping the room. And you assumed respect can be commanded with noise. Decker stared at the table. The junior officers shifted uncomfortably. A few looked at him with open pity, others avoided looking at him at all. General Vance turned slightly, her gaze now on Colonel Matt. "Your base has potential," she said, "but potential means nothing without discipline." "Yes, ma'am," Matt replied softly. She nodded once and faced the room again. "This assessment is complete. There will be no official reprimands. The lesson you've been given is the only one that matters." Then she stepped away from the table, leaving the weight of her presence behind like an afterimage. No exit line, no dramatic flourish, just a door opening and closing. When she was gone, the officers released a collective breath. The briefing room felt colder, emptier, as if something had been extracted from it. Decker did not sleep that night. He lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the evening in his head. The champagne, the laughter, his own words echoing back to him like ghosts. The image of her scar, the black watch on her wrist, the unflinching calm in her eyes, all of it looped in his mind like a training video. He thought of his cadets, the ones who had laughed at his jokes. He thought of the look on Colonel Matt's face when the file appeared on the holographic display. He thought of the way General Vance had said assessment concluded, as if she were closing a book on him. He had been trained to lead under fire, but no one had taught him how to endure shame. At 300 he rose, pulled on his duty uniform and went to the base library. The night clerk looked up, startled. She had never seen a captain there at that hour. He walked past her without speaking, straight to the strategy section. His fingers traced the spines of thick volumes: adaptive warfare, command under chaos, silent competence. He pulled 3 books down and carried them to a table. He read until dawn. General Vance remained on base for 2 more days. She was not seen in public spaces. Rumor placed her everywhere: the hangars, the war rooms, the perimeter posts. No one knew for sure. It didn't matter. Her presence had become an invisible current running under every conversation. In the mess hall, cadets spoke in hushed tones. "Did you see her eyes? She rewrote the simulation code. Spectres real." Instructors noticed the shift. The usual bragging, the casual put-downs, the performance of authority, all had gone quiet. Young officers began double-checking their orders, listening before they spoke. The base itself seemed to take a breath, as if recalibrating. Colonel Matt watched the change with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief because the lesson had taken root. Sorrow because it had come at such a cost for one of his own. Decker was walking the corridors like a man carrying an invisible pack of stones. Matt found him in the simulation center one evening, staring at the secondary terminal now cordoned off with a simple rope barrier. The master sergeant had labeled it Spectre Station in handwritten block letters. "She didn't order that," Matt said quietly, approaching. "I know," Decker's voice was hoarse. "He did it himself." They stood in silence. "You're still in command," Matt said after a while. Decker gave a humorless laugh. "Some command. They look at me like I'm a cautionary tale." "Good," Matt said. "Be one. And then show them what a lesson looks like when it's learned." Decker turned, surprise flickering across his face. The colonel's tone held no mockery, only a quiet challenge. "General Vance left you here for a reason," Matt continued. "She could have buried you. Instead, she gave you a chance to rebuild. Don't waste it." Decker swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Weeks passed. The base changed. Strategy briefings became quieter, sharper. Young officers began to study instead of perform. Readiness scores ticked upward. The casual arrogance that had once filled the air like static began to dissipate. And Decker changed with it. He stopped talking and started listening. He attended night classes in advanced operational analysis. He spent hours running simulations, not to win, but to understand why he lost. He stopped using cadets as props for his own authority. The cadets noticed. Some respected him more for it. Others whispered that he was trying to redeem himself. He didn't care which was true. One morning before sunrise, he walked alone to the plaque newly installed in the main conference room, brushed steel, etched with the words, Lesson 1. Assumptions are a liability. Below it was the command string General Vance had used to end the simulation. Decker stood there for a long time. The letters caught the early light like a blade. He reached out, touched the cold metal with his fingertips, and whispered, "Understood." General Vance was gone, but her legend had already begun to spread beyond the base. Stories circulated in encrypted channels, whispered in briefing rooms, retold in flight bays. Some said she wasn't human, that she was an AI designed to test command resilience. Others swore they'd seen her walking the perimeter at night, a shadow among shadows. No one could agree on the details. Only the lesson remained clear. The quiet one in the room might be the most dangerous mind present. For the young cadets, it became a cautionary tale. For Decker, it became a mandate. He started mentoring the most reserved cadets, the ones overlooked because they didn't speak loudly. He found them in the library, in the corners of the simulation center, watching more than talking. He showed them how to structure an analysis, how to build a plan under pressure, how to hold their ground without theatrics. He never mentioned General Vance by name. He didn't have to. Her presence lived in the discipline he tried to embody. Colonel Matt watched this transformation with a quiet satisfaction. One afternoon he called Decker into his office. "You're different," Matt said simply. Decker met his eyes. "I'm trying to be." "That's enough," Matt replied. "Keep trying." He dismissed him, then turned to the window, looking out at the parade ground where a new class of cadets was drilling. Their movements were precise, disciplined, unadorned. He thought of General Vance and the mirror she had held up to them all. Sometimes a single perfect demonstration does more than 1,000 regulations. That night, as the base settled into its nocturnal rhythm, a figure stood at the edge of the training field, hands in pockets, watching the lights go out one by one. The wind tugged at her hair. She was a silhouette, nothing more. She didn't need to be seen. She had left her lesson behind. And somewhere in the barracks, a humbled captain was studying alone, trying to rise to the standard she had set. A standard carved not in medals, but in silence, in discipline, in the unannounced strength of a mind that refuses to be underestimated. What happens when a myth becomes a standard? What happens when the quiet ones start believing they are allowed to be exactly who they are? The third week after the Code Omega drill began like any other. Reveille sounded across the base, boots hit the ground, cadets poured into the morning air. But something in their rhythm had shifted. Conversations at the mess tables were softer. Debates in the classrooms were sharper, more grounded. Even the way they saluted seemed changed, less theatrical, more precise. Captain Decker felt it every time he walked the corridors. The cadets no longer snapped to attention when he approached. They didn't snicker behind his back either. They just looked at him, measuring, questioning, waiting. The laughter that had once followed him was gone. In its place was a silence that weighed more than any mockery. At first, the silence was suffocating. He would walk past the Spectre station in the simulation center and feel his chest tighten. The terminal sat under its rope barrier like an altar, the keyboard untouched, the monitor dark. The master sergeant had polished the metal plate until it gleamed. Cadets stopped in front of it as if approaching a relic. Decker began to stop there too, but not to gawk, to think, to remember. He could still hear the sound of fabric on glass as General Vance wiped the screen. He could still see the message checkmate pulsing white against black. That single gesture had erased every illusion he'd built about himself. Each night he returned to the library. He read until his eyes blurred. Clausewitz, Boyd, the principles of mission command. He filled notebooks with diagrams and questions. Not answers, questions. What assumptions am I making? What am I not seeing? He started small. In morning briefings, he stopped barking. Instead, he asked cadets what they saw, what they thought the situation demanded. At first, they stared, suspicious. But when he listened, really listened, something unlocked. One night, weeks after the drill, a knock came at his office door. It was a cadet he barely knew, a thin young woman who sat in the back of his seminars, always silent, always perfect in her analyses. "Sir," she said quietly, "I've been working on a simulation scenario. Would you look at it?" Decker hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from him. "Show me." She handed him a data tablet. Her scenario was brutal, asymmetric threats, cascading failures, limited resources, an impossible problem. He began to offer solutions, then caught himself. He looked at her instead. "Walk me through your thinking." She did, calmly, methodically. He realized she had built a trap within the trap, a way to use the enemy's momentum against itself. It was elegant, quiet, deadly. When she finished, she waited, eyes downcast as if expecting dismissal. "That's good," he said slowly. "Really good. Better than anything I came up with at your stage." She blinked, startled. "Keep building it," he said. "Next week you're going to run it in front of the class." Her eyes widened. "Sir. They need to see how you think." She swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." After she left, Decker sat back in his chair. For the first time since the Code Omega drill, a small sense of purpose flickered in him. Maybe this was what Vance had meant, not to bury him, but to force him to become a different kind of leader. Colonel Matt watched the base with a veteran's patience. He saw the cadets' posture changing, their eyes sharpening. He saw Decker moving among them, quieter, slower, listening. At night he would stand at his window and think of General Vance's scar, her black watch, her soft voice. She had left, but she was still here. In his 3 decades, Matt had sat through endless PowerPoint lectures on transformational leadership. None of them had moved the needle. But one afternoon of silent competence from a 4-star general had shifted the entire culture. He found himself repeating her words to his senior staff. "Every catastrophic failure begins with an assumption." He etched it into his own notes. He began to look at his officers differently. Who did he dismiss because they were quiet? Who did he overvalue because they were loud? He began to schedule unannounced drills, not to catch people failing, but to watch how they adapted. The first time, the base responded like a single organism, not a collection of egos. It wasn't perfect, but it was disciplined. Matt allowed himself a small, private smile. Spectre would approve. The young cadet Decker had mentored stood in front of her class a week later, her simulation loaded on the main screen. The room was full of peers, instructors, and even a few visiting officers. She began with a question. "What would you do if everything you depended on failed at once?" A ripple went through the room. It was the same question Code Omega had asked them all. She laid out her scenario with calm precision. As the simulation unfolded, she guided them through each decision point, never raising her voice, never showing off. When the enemy collapsed under its own momentum, the room went silent. At the back, Decker watched. He saw cadets leaning forward, eyes bright. He saw instructors exchanging glances, and he felt something like pride not in himself but in her. When she finished, no one clapped. They simply sat, absorbing it. Decker broke the silence. "That," he said quietly, "is how you win an unwinnable scenario." The cadets turned to look at him. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't grandstanding. He was simply acknowledging skill. The young woman straightened. For the first time, she looked not like a cadet, but like a leader. Rumors about General Vance continued to evolve. Some swore she had been seen boarding a black transport at dawn. Others claimed she was still on base, walking the flight line at night. A few whispered she had retired, vanishing into the classified shadows she'd always inhabited. In the absence of facts, legend took root. The legend was cleaner, sharper, easier to tell. A ghost named Spectre who had come to test them, who had shown them themselves. But in Decker's office, under the dim glow of a desk lamp, the legend wasn't a ghost. It was a command string etched into a plaque. It was a scar across a temple. It was a soft voice saying, "Assessment concluded." He wrote a note on a scrap of paper and taped it above his desk. True competence needs no armor. Months later, a high-level inspection team arrived at the base. They expected to find the usual post-exercise slump. Instead, they found crisp formations, sharp reports, and cadets who asked precise, intelligent questions. They found Decker leading quietly from the back of the room, letting others speak first. After the briefing, one inspector pulled Colonel Matt aside. "What happened here?" he asked. Matt smiled faintly. "We had a guest instructor." The inspector frowned. "I didn't see any orders for that." "You wouldn't," Matt said. "Some lessons don't get logged." On a cold morning near the end of the training cycle, Decker stood alone on the parade ground. Frost glittered on the asphalt. In his hand he held a thin folder, the cadet's final evaluation. She had passed every test, rewritten 3 of the standard scenarios with improvements, and quietly mentored 2 younger classmates. He closed the folder and looked up at the empty reviewing stand. He thought of General Vance standing there, invisible, watching. He raised a hand to his brow and held a silent salute. No one saw him. He didn't need them to. That night he wrote a message on his tablet, but never sent it. "General Vance, you broke me down without a word. You showed me what I was. You left before I could say thank you. If you're still watching, I'm trying. I'm not who I was at that party. Respectfully, C. Decker." He stared at it, then deleted it. The lesson wasn't about asking for forgiveness. It was about becoming someone who didn't need to. He shut off the light and went to the window. Outside, the base slept. In the distance, the Spectre station glowed faintly under its security light, a dark screen reflecting stars. Decker whispered to himself, "Assessment ongoing." And for the first time in months, he felt the weight on his chest shift, not vanish, but become something he could carry. In the mess hall the next morning, cadets sat in quieter groups. The young woman he had mentored passed his table. She gave him a small nod, not deference, recognition. He nodded back. Around them, the base hummed with a new rhythm, one built not on fear of a ghost, but on respect for what that ghost had demanded. Humility, clarity, silent competence. The legend of Spectre had become more than a story. It had become a culture. And somewhere far away, perhaps watching through a feed no one else could see, a woman with a scar at her temple and a black watch on her wrist might have smiled, not because she had humbled a captain, but because she had planted a seed. How does a story outlive the person who started it? How does a single afternoon become a compass for hundreds of futures? By the end of that training cycle, the base no longer looked or felt like the same place. The change wasn't in the paint or the equipment. It was in the pauses between orders. It was in the way junior officers held their shoulders. It was in the way cadets looked at each other when no one else was watching. Colonel Matt noticed it first during an evening walk across the parade ground. The air was sharp, clean, cold. Formation drills were finishing under floodlights. The cadets moved like a single organism, but without the brittle stiffness of rote obedience. There was a suppleness to their coordination, a responsiveness. When an instructor issued a correction, they didn't just snap to it, they adapted, thought, adjusted. Matt stopped at the edge of the training field, hands behind his back. He had spent 30 years watching formations. He knew the difference between performance and discipline. This was discipline. This was what General Vance had tried to gift them, the inner spine of quiet competence. Inside, in one of the classrooms, Captain Decker was sitting at the back while the same cadet he'd mentored ran another exercise. He no longer stood at the front as the voice of authority. He watched, asked questions, guided where needed. The cadets had stopped whispering about Decker's disgrace weeks ago. They now whispered about his turnaround. Some still distrusted it, but others were beginning to respect him in a new way, not as a charismatic performer, but as a leader willing to be changed. That day's exercise was about decentralized command. The cadet at the front, hair pulled back, eyes bright but steady, walked them through a scenario of fractured communications and simultaneous crises. She asked, "Who makes the call when your comms are dead? What do you do when your plan fails?" The room leaned in. Even the instructors at the side were listening. She explained a model of decision-making that gave initiative to the smallest unit without losing the larger intent. It was elegant and quiet. Decker sat with his arms folded, chin lowered, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. He wasn't thinking about medals or promotions. He was thinking about how far she would go if she kept building this discipline. Later in the officers' club, the same room where everything had started, the atmosphere was completely different. Gone were the performative toasts and casual digs. Conversations were low-voiced, thoughtful. There was even a kind of reverence for the space, as though the red light of that code Omega night still haunted the wood paneling. Decker walked in quietly and took a seat by the far wall. A few cadets glanced at him, then back at their conversations. One of them, a young man who had laughed the loudest at his jokes months earlier, stood and walked over. "Sir," he said awkwardly, "I wanted to apologize for how we acted that night." Decker looked up at him. The cadet's hands were clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed somewhere above Decker's head. "You don't owe me an apology," Decker said after a beat. "You owe yourself a standard, hold it." The cadet nodded, cheeks flushing, and walked back to his table. Decker stared into his glass of water. The old Decker would have basked in the apology, used it as proof of his regained authority. The new Decker felt only a quiet sense of responsibility. Colonel Matt began to prepare the next class of cadets for the legend they had inherited. He no longer told the full story of General Vance. He didn't need to. The plaque in the conference room, the Spectre station in the simulation center, and the changed behavior of their instructors told it better than any briefing. Instead, he told them about assumptions, about the danger of mistaking noise for strength, about how the person you underestimate might hold your life in their hands. He quoted her words, clarity under collapse, seeing, listening, humility, until they became part of the base's vocabulary. And when the cadets asked the inevitable question, "Sir, is Spectre real?" he only smiled and said, "The lesson is real." One rainy afternoon, Decker received a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no signature, just a printed quote. "True legacy isn't what you say about yourself. It's the standard others strive to meet long after you're gone." He read it 3 times. His heart kicked against his ribs. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside his notebook, between pages covered in his own handwriting. Was it from her? He didn't know, he would never know, but the words landed like a compass needle settling north. That evening he stood alone in the simulation center. The Spectre station glowed under its security light. He stepped past the rope barrier and laid a hand on the console. The master sergeant looked up from across the room but didn't stop him. Decker didn't type anything. He just stood there, breathing, feeling the cool metal under his palm. He whispered, "Assessment ongoing." In the barracks, the cadet he'd mentored sat on her bunk with her data tablet, building another scenario. She thought about the way General Vance had stood at the secondary terminal, rewriting the rules of the simulation. She thought about how Decker now asked instead of ordered. For years she'd been told to be more assertive, to speak up, to command the room. But here she was, being validated for thinking first, for observing, for holding her ground in silence. Her heart felt lighter than it had in months. She understood now. Her quiet was not a liability. It was discipline. Her calm was not passivity. It was control. She closed her eyes and imagined herself years from now, standing in a real operations center, facing a real unwinnable scenario. She pictured taking a slow breath, scanning the board and doing what needed to be done. Not loudly, not for applause, just correctly. She opened her eyes and went back to work. Weeks turned into months. The base's readiness scores climbed to numbers no one had seen before. Visiting officials remarked on the change but couldn't quite name it. They saw sharper drills, faster responses, fewer mistakes. They didn't see the deeper shift, a culture moving from noise to clarity. Decker kept mentoring quietly, often one cadet at a time. He built a small reading group that met after hours in the library. They studied strategy, decision-making under stress, the psychology of leadership. No ranks, no lectures, just discussion. At first only a handful came, then a dozen. Soon the room was full. He never called it anything, but the cadets began calling it Spectre Class. One evening, Colonel Matt walked past the library and paused at the door. Inside, Decker sat at the head of a long table, not speaking, listening as a cadet presented a breakdown of an historic battle. The others took notes, asked questions, debated respectfully. Matt stood there for a long time unseen. He felt an unexpected sting behind his eyes. All the lectures, all the regulations, all the memos from command, none had done what this quiet culture had done. He turned away, whispering to himself, "Thank you, General." The legend of Spectre continued to spread beyond the base. In training academies across the service, instructors began using the Code Omega scenario as a case study. Not because of the simulated enemy, but because of what had happened inside the command room. They spoke of a mysterious operator who rewrote the game from the inside. They didn't agree on who she was. They didn't need to. The cadets who came through Matt's base carried the lesson out into the wider force. They arrived at new assignments and behaved differently, listened more, assumed less, looked twice at the quiet ones. Slowly, invisibly, a ripple spread. One night, months after the drill, Decker sat at his desk and wrote another unsent message. "General Vance, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but your standard lives here now. We're building something different, and I'm not done learning." He saved it, then closed the file. It wasn't for her. It was for himself, a record of the standard he had chosen to meet. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, and listened to the quiet hum of the base at night. For the first time since that humiliating party, he felt not crushed by the silence but held by it. The silence had become his teacher. On a clear morning, Colonel Matt assembled the graduating class on the parade ground. They stood in perfect formation, boots aligned, eyes forward. The sun caught the brushed steel plaque on the wall behind him. Lesson 1. Assumptions are a liability. Matt spoke without notes. Your rank, your insignia, your reputation, those things are noise. True strength needs no announcement. It is demonstrated in silence, in the calm execution of an impossible task. The person next to you, the one you dismiss as unimportant, might hold the key to your survival. Remember that. Remember the Spectre. The cadets stood in absolute stillness. The words settled into them not as folklore, but as a principle. In the back row, the quiet cadet Decker had mentored felt a surge of something she couldn't name, not pride exactly, not relief. It was like recognition, like a door opening inward. She was no longer an anomaly in this culture. She was its future. Matt looked at their faces and thought of General Vance. She had been gone for months. She might never return, but in a way she had never left. That evening, as the sun went down, Decker walked once more to the Spectre station. The rope barrier was still there, the console still dark. He reached out and rested his hand on the cool metal. He thought of his own arrogance, his own fall, his slow climb back. He thought of the cadet presenting her scenario. He thought of Colonel Matt watching from the shadows. He whispered the only words that mattered: assessment ongoing. The console reflected his face back at him, not the man who had mocked a ghost, but a man trying to live up to one. And somewhere in a classified building on another base, perhaps General Vance glanced at a feed, saw the image of him standing there, and allowed herself a small, invisible nod. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. What happens when the legend is no longer just a story to remember, but a standard you must uphold under fire? What happens when the test stops being simulated and becomes real? The first hint came as a whisper through the base's encrypted comms net, a low-priority advisory from Strategic Command. Unusual activity on the periphery, possible cyber probes, nothing concrete, but Colonel Matt felt the hair rise on the back of his neck when he read it. He'd learned to trust that feeling. He didn't announce it to the cadets. He just began quietly shifting training blocks, rotating watch rotations, asking Decker to run a series of scenario refreshers. It looked like just another drill from the outside. From the inside, it was a slow tightening of the base's reflexes. Decker responded without hesitation. Months of internal change had stripped away his old reflex to bark orders. Instead, he met with his section leaders in the early morning over black coffee and maps, laying out what-ifs. He asked questions, listened to answers, wove the best of their thinking into the plan. The cadet he had mentored, now weeks away from graduation, sat in on those sessions, silent but alert. She took notes on a slim data tablet, her eyes scanning not just the maps but the faces around the table, learning how people made decisions when the stakes were real. "Sir," she said quietly one morning, tapping a sequence on her tablet, "if the probes we're seeing follow this pattern, they're not just testing our perimeter, they're mapping our internal redundancies." Decker leaned over her shoulder, eyes narrowing. The pattern was subtle, a cascade of seemingly harmless pings against low-value nodes, but linked together, it spelled reconnaissance. "Good catch," he said. "Push that to Colonel Matt. Flag it as potential pre-attack shaping." She nodded once and sent the packet. Matt called an immediate staff meeting. "We don't panic," he told them. "We prepare, quietly." For the next 3 days, the base felt like a coiled spring. Training continued, but with an undercurrent of focus. Cadets double-checked their equipment without being told. Instructors ran through contingencies without raising their voices. Decker and the cadet refined a set of emergency protocols for command continuity if communications went dark. On the 4th day at 2:30, the lights in the command center flickered. A brief ripple of static ran through the internal network. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to notice. Decker was already in the ops room when it happened. He looked at the status board, then at the cadet beside him. She met his eyes without flinching. "Assessment ongoing," she murmured under her breath. He almost smiled. Matt entered, pulling on his duty jacket, eyes sharp. "Report." "Network instability," Decker said. "Could be nothing, could be the first bite." "Assume the second," Matt said. "Shift to condition 2 quietly, no alarms." Orders rippled out in low voices. The base slid into heightened readiness like a cat stretching. No panic, no noise. At 3:17, the first real strike came, not kinetic, but digital. A sophisticated intrusion against the drone control grid. The attackers didn't smash. They insinuated sliding malicious code along maintenance channels, trying to turn the base's own assets into blind spots. The watch officer's hands trembled over his console. "Sir, I'm losing handshake with half the swarm." Decker was already moving. "Pull them into sandbox. Quarantine protocols Bravo through Delta." The cadet leaned over a secondary screen. "They're piggybacking on our diagnostic pings. If we cut the pings, they lose the vector." "Do it," Decker said. She keyed in the sequence. The attack faltered, probes flickering out like fireflies snuffed by wind. Matt watched silently, His base wasn't panicking, it was thinking. An hour later, the second strike came, a physical infiltration attempt at the outer perimeter, masked by a local power failure. It was small, fast, probing, not an assault but a test of reflexes. Decker arrived at the perimeter station just as the alert flashed. The responding squad was already moving, coordinated, precise. Cadets who had once tripped over each other during drills now flowed into position without wasted motion. They didn't shout. They didn't posture. They executed. The intruders, two figures in dark camouflage, were intercepted within meters of the fence line. No shots fired. No heroics. Just clean containment. Matt's voice came over the secure channel, calm and steady. Perimeter secure. Stand down to condition 2. Good work. Decker exhaled slowly. The cadet beside him looked at the detained infiltrators being led away and felt something settle in her chest. The training had not been for nothing. Back in the command center, Matt gathered his senior officers. "What we just saw," he said, "is the difference between performance and preparedness. 6 months ago, that would have been chaos. Today it was discipline." He looked at Decker. "You did well." Decker shook his head. "They did well, I just stopped getting in their way." Matt allowed himself a small smile. "That's leadership." The cadet sat quietly at the edge of the room, absorbing everything. Later that night, alone in his office, Decker opened the unsent message to General Vance he kept on his tablet. He added a single line. "We were tested today, we held." Then he saved it again without sending. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The base had passed a real test, but he knew tests never truly ended. They evolved. The lesson of Spectre was never about a single moment. It was about living in readiness without arrogance, humility without paralysis. He closed his eyes and remembered the way she had looked at him that night in the simulation center, calm, unreadable, waiting to see what he would become. "I'm still becoming," he whispered. The cadet lay awake in her bunk, staring at the dark. She thought of the intruders at the fence line, of the quick, silent professionalism of the response. She thought of Decker's steady voice, of Matt's measured command. She remembered how, months ago, she'd been told to be louder, to project more. Now she had watched an entire base operate like the inside of her own mind, quiet, precise, deliberate. It filled her with a strange kind of hope. She turned on her side and pulled up the scenario she'd been building on her tablet. Not a simulation this time, but a concept for a real-world rapid analysis protocol. Something to catch subtle patterns in enemy behavior before they escalated. She began typing, her fingers moving fast and sure. The next morning, Matt called a brief but pointed staff meeting. "No press releases about last night," he said. "No leaks. No bragging. What happened is classified and stays that way. We'll file our reports, tighten our protocols, and move on." He looked at Decker. Quiet professionalism, understood. "Understood," Decker said. The cadet glanced at both of them and felt a kind of pride she couldn't have put into words. In the weeks that followed, the base received commendations from higher command for exemplary readiness. The details were buried in classification, but inside the wire, everyone knew. They didn't need plaques or medals. They had done what they were supposed to do without noise. Decker's library sessions grew. More cadets came. He began rotating them into real staff meetings as observers. He wanted them to see decision-making in its messy, unglamorous reality. The cadet he had first mentored now led the sessions half the time. She spoke more, but not louder, clearer. She guided discussions, asked hard questions, forced her peers to think. Sometimes Decker would sit back and watch her and think, "This is what General Vance planted. This is the harvest." Colonel Matt started writing a set of internal notes he never intended to publish. He called them Spectre Principles. Simple, unadorned sentences about leadership under collapse, about humility and clarity. He kept them on a secure drive. One day, perhaps, he would share them with the right people. One line he wrote late at night summed up what he was seeing. Competence is silent. Arrogance is a deafening admission of insecurity. He saved it and closed the file. At dusk, Decker walked out to the perimeter where the intruders had been caught. The ground still showed faint scuffs where boots had pressed into the dirt. He crouched, running a hand over the marks, thinking about how easily this could have gone differently. He stood, straightened, and looked out at the dark horizon. Somewhere beyond it, perhaps, was General Vance, moving through her own classified world. He raised his hand in a small, unseen salute. "Assessment ongoing," he said softly. Then he turned and walked back toward the lights of the base, carrying not the weight of shame but the quiet gravity of responsibility. Inside the barracks, the cadet saved her new protocol and sat back, rubbing her eyes. She thought of the words on the plaque in the conference room. She whispered them aloud. "Assumptions are a liability." She smiled to herself, lesson learned. The bass hummed around her like a well-tuned engine, not perfect, not invulnerable, but awake. And somewhere, in a file no one else could access, perhaps General Vance's watch list registered a quiet uptick. A base that had once been a stage for arrogance now running on silent competence. A seed had taken root. Sometimes a legend isn't a ghost story. It's a set of habits, a way of thinking, a living mirror you hold up to yourself until you no longer need the mirror. That night, under a clear sky full of stars, the base slept. Decker slept. The cadet slept. Colonel Matt sat in his office, writing one last note before turning out the light. True strength needs no announcement. It is demonstrated in silence, in the calm execution of an impossible task. He closed the file, shut off the lamp, and sat for a moment in the dark. In the glass of the window, his own reflection looked back at him, and behind it the parade ground where new cadets would stand tomorrow. He whispered, "Assessment ongoing." And in that whisper was not fear, not shame, but a quiet, steady promise. When does a lesson stop belonging to the teacher and become the student's own? When does the mirror stop reflecting and start transforming? Spring came late to the desert around the base. The wind carried dust across the runways and the training fields shimmered under the sun. Inside the wire, a new class of cadets had begun their cycle. They arrived loud, eager, and full of academy reflexes, salutes too sharp, voices too bright. They hadn't lived through the code Omega night. They'd only heard whispers. Captain Decker watched them from the edge of the drill field with a strange kind of déjà vu. He saw himself in their posturing, their hunger to be seen. He also saw the veterans of the last cycle, cadets who had absorbed the Spectre standard, quietly guiding their peers, setting examples without theatrics. It wasn't something you could order. It was something you had to model. He folded his arms, the sun hot on his uniform sleeve, and glanced at the young officer who now stood beside him, the cadet he'd once mentored. She had graduated, pinned on her lieutenant's bars, and accepted a slot as an instructor at the very base where she'd been shaped. "Thought you'd be gone by now," Decker said quietly. She smiled faintly. "Thought I would too, but somebody has to keep the culture alive." He nodded. "It's yours now." She shook her head. "No, it's everyone's, that's the point." Colonel Matt sat in his office reading a report from higher command. It was an invitation and an order rolled into one, a joint exercise at a different installation. High visibility, observers from several allied forces. The base had been selected to lead the planning cell. He set the paper down and stared out the window. This was the next test. They'd been transformed in isolation. Now they'd have to hold that standard in front of an audience. He called Decker and the young lieutenant into his office. "This exercise isn't just about interoperability," Matt said. "It's a chance to export a culture, but that makes it harder. You'll have people who don't know your rhythm who will misinterpret your quiet as weakness. You'll be tempted to revert to noise to prove yourselves. Don't." Decker met his eyes. "We'll hold it, sir." Matt nodded once. "Then go show them what competence looks like without a megaphone." They deployed a small planning team to the Allied base 2 weeks later. The contrast was jarring. The host installation buzzed with surface polish, crisp salutes, immaculate PowerPoint slides, loud morning briefings. It looked impressive. But behind the noise, Decker could sense the same brittle energy he'd once worn like armor. He and the young lieutenant moved through the planning cells, listening, asking quiet questions, offering alternatives. At first they were ignored. Then, slowly, people began to notice that their suggestions worked. They started running short tabletop simulations at night, demonstrating how decentralized command could speed decision cycles. One evening, after a particularly chaotic joint drill, a major from an Allied force cornered Decker in the mess. "How are your people so calm?" he demanded. "You're not shouting, you're not posturing, but things work." Decker took a sip of water. "We were humbled," he said simply. "We built from that." The major frowned, then gave a small nod. "Maybe that's what we need." The young lieutenant spent hours with the junior officers of the Allied unit, showing them how to map assumptions, how to ask the right questions before giving orders. She didn't lecture. She modeled. They began calling her Spectre's apprentice behind her back, half in jest, half in awe. Late one night, she sat in the dim glow of her laptop in the temporary quarters, drafting a memorandum she didn't know if she'd ever send. It was addressed to General Vance. She wrote, "Ma'am, you don't know me, but you changed the trajectory of my life without a word. Today, I tried to pass on your standard. If you're still watching, thank you." She stared at it for a long time, then closed the file unsent. The lesson wasn't about gratitude. It was about living the standard. The joint exercise culminated in a complex scenario combining cyber intrusion, kinetic probes, and a simulated hostage crisis. Decker's planning cell built a response framework that looked unorthodox on paper, but was rooted in the principles Vance had embodied: clarity under collapse, decentralized initiative, humility before complexity. When the exercise began, the host base's senior staff defaulted to loud orders and rigid control. Their systems began to choke under the weight of their own procedures. Decker's cell, operating quietly in the background, kept adapting, shifting resources, making small corrections without fanfare. Hours later, the scoreboard was undeniable. The quiet cell had outperformed the official command. The observers took notes. The Allied officers exchanged glances. Something had shifted. Afterwards, in the debrief, a colonel from the Allied force said, "Whatever you're doing at your base, keep doing it. It works." The young lieutenant glanced at Decker, who said nothing. He didn't need to. Back at their home base weeks later, the two of them stood again at the Spectre station. The rope barrier still marked it off. Dust motes floated in the beam of a security light. Decker rested his hand on the console. "She's probably never coming back here," he said. The lieutenant nodded. "She doesn't have to." They stood in silence. Outside, the new class of cadets drilled under the stars. "Assessment ongoing," Decker murmured. The lieutenant echoed him softly. "Assessment ongoing." Colonel Matt began to notice subtle costs creeping in with the change. The quiet standard demanded constant self-reflection. It wasn't easy to maintain. Some officers struggled with the lack of overt validation. A few reverted to old habits, mistaking silence for invisibility rather than discipline. He called Decker into his office. "We can't just teach them to be quiet," he said. "We have to teach them why. Otherwise, we risk breeding passivity instead of competence." Decker nodded, understood. They began designing a new module, not about tactics but about mindset. They called it active silence. It taught cadets to pair observation with initiative, humility with decisive action. The lieutenant helped write the curriculum. She built exercises where cadets had to lead without speaking for the first 2 minutes, forcing them to plan non-verbally, to read the room, to trust their peers. It was awkward at first. Then it became eye-opening. Late one night, Decker sat alone in the library after a session. He opened his unsent message to General Vance again and added another line. "We've started teaching active silence. It's harder than I thought, but they're learning." He saved it, shut off the screen, and sat in the dark. He thought about how strange it was that a woman who had said so few words to him had reshaped his entire concept of leadership. He whispered into the empty library, "Thank you," then shook his head. The words weren't for her. They were for himself, a marker of how far he'd come. The young lieutenant walked the perimeter alone at dawn, the sky just beginning to pale. She paused at the fence line where months ago intruders had been caught. She put her hand on the cold metal and thought about the cadets who would stand here after her. She didn't know if she'd ever meet General Vance. She didn't know if Vance even remembered that afternoon at the base. But she felt the weight of carrying a standard set by someone who had expected nothing in return. She straightened her shoulders and whispered the words she'd heard Decker say so many times. "Assessment ongoing." Then she turned and walked back toward the lights of the barracks. Inside Colonel Matt's office, the brushed steel plaque caught the morning sun. Lesson 1. Assumptions are a liability. Below it, the command string that had ended the simulation glowed faintly. Matt ran his fingers over the etching. He wondered how many more ripples had spread from that single moment, ripples he'd never see, lives he'd never know were changed. Sometimes leadership wasn't about what you did in the moment. It was about the echoes you left behind. He sat down at his desk and opened the draft of his Spectre Principles. He added a new line. "A legend is not a person. It's a standard you choose to live by when no one is watching." He saved the file, closed his eyes for a moment, and felt the weight of quiet pride. That evening, as the sun went down and the desert cooled, Decker and the young lieutenant walked the flight line. The roar of engines in the distance faded to silence. "You ever wonder where she is?" the lieutenant asked. "All the time," Decker said. "You think she knows what she did here?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I think she knows what she does everywhere. That's why she does it." They reached the end of the tarmac. The sky above them was streaked with the last light of day. "She taught us that respect is earned in moments of crisis," Decker said softly, "not demanded in moments of pride." The lieutenant nodded. "And that one perfect demonstration of skill can outlast a lifetime of self-promotion." They stood there until the stars came out, neither speaking, both carrying the same unspoken promise: to keep living the lesson, to keep building a culture that might outlast them. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. What happens when the lesson you've built your identity around is tested outside your own walls? What happens when the mirror you've held up for others finally reflects back on you? The call came in the middle of the night. Not a drill, not a simulation. A real-world emergency in a remote border sector where a humanitarian convoy had gone dark under threat from an irregular militia. Allied forces were pinned down, communications jammed. Higher command needed a planning cell with no ego and no lag time. They sent for the base that had become synonymous with Spectre. Colonel Matt assembled his senior staff in the dim light of the operations center. Decker stood at his shoulder, the young lieutenant beside him, her tablet already awake. Around them sat a hand-picked group of instructors and cadets who had lived the lesson of Code Omega and active silence. "This isn't an exercise," Matt said quietly. "We're not here to run a show. We're here to bring people home alive. You know what to do." No one saluted. No one made a speech. They simply bent over the map. The convoy's situation was bad. A narrow mountain pass, jammed comms, unknown number of hostiles. Air support limited. Time short. It was exactly the kind of unwinnable scenario the Spectre station had been built to model. Decker felt the old surge of adrenaline rise in his chest. Months ago it would have triggered a barked order. Now he inhaled slowly, hearing Vance's soft voice in his memory, clarity under collapse. He turned to the lieutenant, pattern analysis. She was already drawing lines on her screen. The jamming's not broadband, it's pulsed. If we time our bursts between pulses, we can slip a microburst of encrypted comms through. It won't be much, but enough for short orders. Do it, Decker said. Who's best to coordinate on the ground? Sergeant Hale, she said without hesitation. He's calm under pressure and knows the terrain. Decker nodded. We'll push everything through him, decentralize the rest. Across the table, a cadet, one of the new generation, cleared his throat. Sir, if we reroute the convoy's vehicles through the old service trail, we can cut exposure time in half. Decker looked at him. The cadet's face was pale but steady. Show me. He did. It was risky but sound. Decker gave a single nod. Good work, your point on that thread. The cadet blinked, surprised, then bent to his screen with renewed focus. Around them the planning cell hummed, not frantic, not quiet, but alive with disciplined energy. Minutes later the first microburst slipped through the jamming. A garbled but readable message from Sergeant Hale blinked onto the screen. Pinned but mobile, hostiles probing, holding high ground. Decker keyed in a concise reply, shift to service trail, intervals 20 meters, time window 4 minutes, trust your lead. He sent it, then sat back, breathing evenly. He looked at the lieutenant. This is the moment. Either they believe in the method or it fails. She met his eyes. We've trained them for this without knowing it. On the screen, small blue icons representing the convoy began to move, inching toward the narrow trail. Red dots flickered on the ridgelines but did not converge. The militia hadn't seen the shift yet. The next pulse window opened. Another microburst from Hale, trail reached, no contact yet, moving. Good, Decker murmured. Maintain spacing. Keep signals dark except on pulse windows. He felt the room's collective breath. No one spoke unless necessary. Every eye was on the board, watching the blue icons creep like beads of light through a narrow vein of darkness. Then a ripple of red appeared ahead, a hostile unit moving fast toward the trail. The room tensed. The lieutenant's fingers danced over her tablet. They're converging blind. They don't know where we are yet. If we trigger a false transmission upslope, we can lure them off. Do it, Decker said. She tapped a command. An allied drone, pre-programmed for contingencies, sent out a decoy burst from a different grid square. The red dots veered, chasing the phantom. The blue icons kept moving. Colonel Matt stood with his arms folded, face impassive. Inside, his heart hammered. He had seen dozens of operations run under noise, ego, and showmanship. He had never seen one run like this, quiet, adaptive, collective. 37 minutes later, the last blue icon cleared the pass. A final microburst from Hale, convoy through, 0 casualties, standing by. Silence fell over the operations center. Decker exhaled. The lieutenant set her tablet down, hands trembling slightly now that it was over. The cadet who had suggested the service trail stared at the screen, blinking hard. Matt looked around the room. No cheers, no high fives, just a collective, almost reverent quiet. Finally he said softly, "You brought them home." Decker shook his head. They brought themselves home. We just stopped making assumptions. Matt's gaze held his for a long moment. Then he said, Spectre would approve. After the convoy was safe, the official commendations began to trickle in. Higher command sent encrypted congratulations. The Allied force sent a formal note of gratitude. No names could be used in public, but the base's reputation deepened. Decker filed the reports, then went to the library as he always did. He opened his unsent message to General Vance and added, "We took the method outside the wire. It held. Thank you for the standard." He saved it, then closed the tablet without sending. Across the base, the lieutenant sat in her small office, staring at a blank screen. She thought about writing to Vance herself. She thought about what she'd say. Then she closed the file. Living the lesson was the message. Weeks later, she was invited to speak at the academy. Not a lecture, just a small seminar for senior cadets on decision-making under collapse. She accepted reluctantly. When she entered the classroom, the cadets looked at her with polite curiosity. They'd heard rumors but not the story. She began without introduction. What would you do if everything you depended on failed at once? A ripple went through the room. She laid out the convoy scenario step by step. She didn't glorify it. She described the mistakes they'd avoided, the small decisions that mattered, the discipline of silence. When she finished, one cadet raised a hand. "Ma'am, is Spectre real?" She thought of General Vance's scar, her black watch, her soft voice. She thought of Decker's quiet redemption, Matt's patient stewardship, the convoy slipping through the pass under enemy eyes. She said simply, "The lesson is real." The cadets leaned forward, eyes bright. She felt a strange mixture of humility and responsibility. She wasn't a myth. She was just someone trying to live up to one. Colonel Matt watched the video feed of her seminar later that night. He sat alone in his office, the plaque's etched letters catching the lamp light. He added another line to his Spectre principles. A myth becomes real the moment you act as if it's true. He saved the file and leaned back, eyes closed. The ripples were moving outward. He would never see their full reach. That was fine. That was the work. On a cold evening, months after the convoy rescue, Decker stood again at the Spectre station. The rope barrier was still there, though worn now at the edges from so many hands. He placed his palm on the console, closed his eyes, and whispered the words that had become a mantra across the base. Assessment ongoing. Behind him in the doorway, the lieutenant paused, listening. She didn't speak. She simply stood with him, sharing the silence. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. When does a lesson end? When does a ghost stop haunting and start guiding? A year had passed since the Code Omega night that changed everything. The desert wind still pushed dust across the runways. Cadets still marched, saluted, and learned. But now the base had a rhythm of its own, unforced, deliberate, alive. Colonel Matt walked the perimeter at dawn. The air was cold and smelled faintly of jet fuel. From a distance, he could see Decker running a field exercise. No clipboard, no theatrics, just quiet direction. Beside him moved the young lieutenant, now fully an instructor in her own right, leading small knots of cadets through decision-making drills. They had stopped talking about Spectre as a person. The word had become shorthand for a way of thinking. Spectre check your plan meant strip away assumptions. Spectre quiet meant observe before acting. It was no longer a legend to whisper about. It was a discipline to practice. Matt stopped at the plaque in the main conference room, brushed steel, etched letters catching the early light. Lesson 1. Assumptions are a liability. Below it, the command string that had ended the simulation still glowed faintly. The metal was worn smooth by fingertips. He rested his own hand on it and thought, she's still here. Captain Decker had changed so completely that new cadets didn't recognize the old stories about him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady gravity. He had been invited to teach at the academy but turned it down. "I'm not finished here," he told Matt. "I want to keep building." He still went to the library at night, but now the chairs were full. Cadets crowded around tables, discussing scenarios, sketching decision trees, challenging each other with impossible problems. They called it Spectre Hours. Decker listened more than he spoke. Sometimes he saw the young lieutenant guiding a discussion, sometimes a cadet he barely knew leading an analysis. The culture had become self-sustaining. One night, after the session had ended, he lingered alone at the back table. He opened his unsent message to General Vance and scrolled through the lines he'd added over the past year. "We were tested today, we held. We've started teaching active silence. It's harder than I thought. We took the method outside the wire. It held. He added one more line. It's no longer your standard. It's ours now. He saved it, then closed the file without sending. He didn't need to send it. Living it was the message. The young lieutenant carried the standard outward in her own way. She designed new exercises, blending digital threats, moral dilemmas, and asymmetric problems. Her cadets began outperforming their peers across the service. Other bases asked for her curriculum. She shared it freely, without credit. At night she sometimes walked the perimeter alone, hand brushing the cold fence, eyes scanning the horizon. She thought of General Vance. She still hadn't met her. Maybe she never would. Maybe that was the point. She whispered, "Assessment ongoing," and turned back to the lights. One afternoon, a classified envelope arrived for Colonel Matt. Inside was a single page stamped with a level of clearance he had rarely seen. It wasn't a set of orders, not exactly. It was a notification. Strategic Assessment Group 7 thanks you for your cooperation. Continue as you are. No signature. No contact information. Matt sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. He looked at the plaque on the wall and almost smiled. It wasn't praise exactly, but it was an acknowledgement, a silent salute from the shadows. Months later, the base hosted a quiet ceremony for its graduating class. No fanfare, just a formation on the parade ground under a pale sky. Decker stood at the edge with the lieutenant, watching the cadets file past. Each one carried not just a diploma but a way of thinking they would take into the wider world. As the formation broke up, one cadet, a small, quiet woman who had rarely spoken during training but excelled in every analysis exercise, approached the lieutenant. "Ma'am," she said softly, "thank you. I used to think I had to be loud to lead. Now I know different." The lieutenant smiled. "You don't have to be loud, you have to be clear, hold the standard." The cadet nodded and walked away, shoulders squared. Decker watched her go. "Another seed," he murmured. "Another mirror," the lieutenant said. That evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, Matt, Decker, and the lieutenant walked together to the Spectre station. The rope barrier was still there, though worn now like an old flag. Dust motes drifted in the low light. They stood around the console without speaking. Finally, Matt said quietly, "I used to think leadership was about what you told people. Now I think it's about what you show them." Decker nodded. "What you show them when you think no one's watching." The lieutenant rested her hand on the cool metal. "Assessment ongoing." They stood there until the stars came out, a trio of silhouettes around a dark screen that had once changed everything. None of them took a photo. None of them posted about it. They simply let the moment be what it was. Far away, in a secure facility no one at the base had ever seen, a woman with a faint scar at her temple and a black watch on her wrist read, "A brief report from Strategic Assessment Group 7." She scrolled to the bottom, where a small, informal note had been appended by an analyst. "The base formerly assessed under Code Omega has achieved highest readiness metrics in the region. Cultural shift sustained. Spectre, legend now standard." General Vance, Spectre, sat back in her chair. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply closed the file and reached for a pen, making a small mark in a leather notebook. Then she rose and walked down a silent corridor toward her next assignment. She had never returned to that base. She never would, but in a way she had never left. That night, under a clear desert sky, the base slept. In the library, notebooks lay open on tables filled with diagrams and questions. In the barracks, cadets dreamed of future assignments. On the parade ground, the plaque glinted faintly in the moonlight. Lesson 1. Assumptions are a liability. Below it, the command string that had once ended an impossible simulation caught the light like a blade. Inside his quarters, Decker lay awake for a moment, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the man he had been at that party, loud, sure, blind. He thought of the woman who had stood still and silent until he revealed himself. He thought of the long months of rebuilding. And he thought of the cadets now walking into a service subtly changed because one person had held up a mirror. He whispered into the dark, assessment ongoing. In the instructor's quarters, the young lieutenant sat at her desk, finishing a lesson plan. She closed her laptop and looked at the stars through the window. She thought of General Vance, not as a ghost but as a living principle. She whispered the same words. Assessment ongoing. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a quiet woman stepped onto a tarmac, blending into a small team boarding an unmarked transport. She didn't look back. She never needed to. Sometimes a legend isn't about being remembered. It's about leaving behind a standard that lives without you. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And sometimes, in the calm execution of an impossible task, you stop being someone's student and become the keeper of the lesson. Assessment ongoing.